It was a cold morning in the winter of 1944, and the war in Europe had reached the kind of brutal, grinding stalemate that broke lesser men into pieces. Somewhere in a forward command post not far from the Belgian border, a British staff officer unfolded a signal and read it twice. Then he read it a third time. His face didn't change. Trained men don't let their faces change. But his hands, those gave him away. They were shaking, not from the cold, not from exhaustion, but from something far more dangerous in the middle of a coalition war. He was holding words that should never have been written down. Words from Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, commander of the 21st Army Group, the most decorated British general in the European theater. Words that described the fighting men of the United States Army, soldiers who had bled from Normandy to the Siegfried Line, as undisciplined, poorly led, and frankly cowards. The officer folded the signal carefully. He knew what it meant. He knew what it could do. He knew, above all, that if one particular American general ever laid eyes on those words, the fallout wouldn't just be diplomatic. It would be seismic. It could fracture the Allied coalition at the exact moment Hitler was preparing to launch his most desperate counteroffensive of the entire war. And then, someone made a decision that changed everything. They let Patton find out. What followed over the next 72 hours was one of the most explosive, dangerous, and deliberately buried confrontations of the Second World War. A confrontation that threatened to tear apart the greatest military alliance in human history, and almost no one who lived through it was willing to talk about it afterward. Until now. To truly understand what happened the day Patton heard those words, you have to understand the world that produced the rivalry between two of the most brilliant and infuriating generals of the 20th century. You have to understand what the war had done to both of them by late 1944. You have to understand what was at stake, because this wasn't just two men arguing over tactics or pride. This was a confrontation that revealed the deepest fractures inside the Allied command, fractures that Hitler himself was counting on. George S. Patton, by the autumn of 1944, was simultaneously the most celebrated and the most controversial general in the United States Army. He had already been nearly destroyed by his own mouth twice. The slapping incidents in Sicily in August 1943, when Patton struck two shell-shocked soldiers in field hospitals, had come within a hair's breadth of ending his career before it. Truly began. Eisenhower had nearly relieved him. The American press had savaged him. Politicians back home had called for his head. Patton had survived only because Eisenhower understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that George Patton was irreplaceable on a battlefield. But surviving was different from thriving. After Sicily, Patton had been deliberately sidelined, used as a decoy in the elaborate Operation Fortitude deception designed to convince Hitler that the real D-Day invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. While Bradley commanded the actual invasion forces, Patton sat in England, commanding a ghost army, seething with a rage he barely kept contained. He wrote in his diary during those months with the kind of raw, unfiltered fury that no sane man would commit to paper if he thought history would one day read it. He felt humiliated. He felt wasted. He felt that the war was being won in inches, while men like him could have won it in miles. When Patton finally landed in France in late July 1944 and was given command of the Third Army, something extraordinary happened. He moved. While the entire Allied line had been crawling forward against German resistance with painful, bloody slowness, Patton broke through the German defenses at Avranches and simply refused to stop. His armored columns swept across France with a speed that left even his own supply lines struggling to keep up. In a matter of weeks, the Third Army liberated more French territory than the entire Allied force had managed in the previous 2 months. The name Patton became electric. In American newspapers and British drawing rooms and German command bunkers, the name carried a charge that other generals simply didn't have. And this was precisely the problem. Because on the other side of the alliance, a very different kind of general was watching Patton's advances with a very different kind of expression. Bernard Law Montgomery was, in the autumn of 1944, in the most complicated position of his remarkable career. Monty, as he was universally known, was Britain's great war hero. His victory at El Alamein in 1942 had been the turning point that saved the British Desert Campaign, and Churchill had elevated him to the status of a national icon. Montgomery was meticulous, careful, methodical. He believed in overwhelming preparation before any attack, in never committing his forces until he was certain the odds were in his favor. His critics called him timid. His supporters called him professional. The truth, as it usually does, lived somewhere complicated in between. Montgomery had commanded all Allied ground forces during the Normandy invasion, and he was profoundly proud of that role. But as the campaign moved forward and the American forces grew in number, eventually dwarfing the British contribution in terms of sheer manpower and equipment, the command structure shifted. Eisenhower took direct control of ground forces. Montgomery was given command of the 21st Army Group, a powerful formation, but no longer the overall ground commander. This was, for Monty, not merely a professional adjustment. It was a wound. He believed, with the absolute conviction of a man who had never struggled with self-doubt, that he should be the one directing the entire Allied ground campaign. He had tried repeatedly to convince Eisenhower to give him that authority back. Eisenhower had repeatedly and politely refused. Into this brittle situation came the autumn of 1944 and a strategy called Operation Market Garden. Market Garden was Montgomery's brainchild. It was audacious, some said brilliant, others said reckless. A plan to drop 3 Allied airborne divisions deep into Holland, seize a chain of bridges over the major Dutch rivers, and create a corridor through which British armored forces could drive into Germany and potentially end the war before Christmas. Patton had opposed it fiercely. Patton believed the resources being poured into Market Garden should have been given to him. Give him the fuel, give him the ammunition, he argued, and the Third Army would be in Germany before the autumn leaves finished falling. Eisenhower had overruled him. Market Garden launched in September 1944, and it failed. Not completely, the first several bridges were taken, and Allied forces made genuine progress. But the final objective, the bridge at Arnhem, could not be held against fierce German resistance. The British 1st Airborne Division was destroyed trying to hold it. Thousands of men were killed or captured. The corridor was never secured to the depth needed, and the grand dream of ending the war in 1944 evaporated with the autumn fog over the Dutch countryside. This failure, which Patton had predicted and privately gloated over, created a seething resentment inside Montgomery that he was utterly incapable of concealing. In Monty's mind, Market Garden had not failed because of flawed planning. It had failed because the Americans had not given it sufficient support. The Americans had prioritized their own advances. Patton had been draining fuel and supplies from the northern thrust. It was American selfishness, American indiscipline, and the fundamental inability of American soldiers to execute at the level of British professionals that had doomed his great operation. These were not opinions Montgomery kept entirely to himself. And that was where the catastrophe began. In late November 1944, with the Allied front lines relatively stabilized and a deep, uncomfortable quiet settling over the Ardennes region, the kind of quiet that experienced soldiers find more unsettling than noise, Montgomery attended a conference of senior British officers at his headquarters. What he said during that conference was reported differently by different people present, as such things always are. But the core of it was consistent across accounts. Monty spoke at length about the failures of the American approach to warfare. He spoke about the lack of discipline in American units. He spoke about the tendency of American commanders to advance recklessly without securing their flanks. He spoke about American soldiers who didn't hold ground under pressure with the same tenacity as British troops. And somewhere in the course of that conversation, either in the formal session or in the informal discussions that followed, he used a word that had no business being applied to the men who had bled their way across France. The word was cowards. The exact context of how he used it matters and has been debated ever since. Some accounts suggest he applied it to specific American units that had pulled back under German counterattacks. Others suggest he used it more broadly. but the word was used. It was heard. And in the world of a coalition military command, where every senior officer had aides, staff officers, liaison teams, and a dozen different nationalities passing through, headquarters every day, the notion that such a statement could be contained was pure fantasy. The signal reached American hands within 48 hours. Now, here is where the history becomes genuinely murky in the way that the most dangerous history always does. Because the chain of transmission between Montgomery's headquarters and George Patton is not cleanly documented. What is clear is that Patton learned of it. What is less clear is whether he learned from an official channel, from a British staff officer who felt the statement was unjust and passed it informally, or from one of the American liaison officers embedded with 21st Army Group who included it in a situation report that went further up the chain than it was supposed to. What every account of those days agrees on is this: George Patton's reaction when he learned that Bernard Montgomery had called American soldiers cowards was not what anyone expected. He did not immediately explode. That's what everyone expected. Patton was famous for his volcanic fury, for his scorching monologues, for the kind of spectacular outbursts that his staff had learned to ride out the way sailors ride out. Squalls, brace, hold on, wait for it to pass. But when this particular piece of information landed in front of him, the man who witnesses described as sitting at his field desk in a farmhouse somewhere in Luxembourg did something different. He went very quiet. General Hobart Gay, Patton's chief of staff and one of the men closest to him throughout the European campaign, would later describe that moment in terms that he clearly never forgot. Gay said that Patton read the information twice, set it down on the table in front of him, and sat in absolute silence for what felt like a very long time. Then he looked up and asked a single question. He asked whether any American officer had formally protested the statement through official channels. When Gay told him that as far as he knew, no formal protest had been logged, Patton nodded. And then he said something that Gay would quote for the rest of his life. He said that Montgomery had made a mistake that only a fool makes in wartime. He had put his contempt into words at a moment when words had consequences. Then Patton stood up, buttoned his jacket, and told Gay to get Omar Bradley on the telephone. Omar Nelson Bradley was, in many ways, everything Patton was not. Quiet where Patton was loud, careful where Patton was reckless with words, genuinely modest where Patton performed modesty badly and didn't particularly care if anyone could tell the difference. Bradley had risen to command the 12th Army Group, which encompassed the 1st Army under Courtney Hodges and Patton's own 3rd Army. He was, in the hierarchy of the American command in Europe, Patton's direct superior. He was also one of the men who had known Patton longest, who understood him most clearly, and who was consistently the steadying influence that prevented Patton's worst instincts from becoming catastrophes. Bradley was fully aware of the tensions with Montgomery. He shared many of them. The relationship between the American commanders and Montgomery had been grinding toward open rupture for months. Bradley had his own profound frustrations with Monty's style, his habit of claiming credit, his tendency to request more than his share of resources, and his absolute certainty that his own judgment was superior to everyone else's in the theater. But Bradley also understood that the relationship could not be allowed to break openly, not with the war at the stage it was at, not with Hitler still holding substantial forces in the field. When Patton called, the conversation between them was one that neither man left extensive written records of, which is itself significant. Patton's diary from that period is careful in a way that was uncharacteristic of him, suggesting he was very aware of what he was committing to paper. What is clear from the fragmented record is that Bradley agreed the statement was outrageous, and agreed that it could not be simply absorbed in silence. He agreed that some form of formal response was necessary. What he told Patton, explicitly and directly, was that the response had to go through proper channels, and that under no circumstances was Patton to confront Montgomery personally. Patton told Bradley he understood. He was not being entirely truthful. Because even as he was having that conversation with Bradley, even as he was nodding in agreement with the principle of proper channels and coalition harmony, George Patton was already calculating something different. He was calculating what the moment actually required, not what the rules said it required. He was thinking about the men of the Third Army, about the soldiers who had crossed France in the heat of summer, who had fought through the rain of autumn, who were now staring into a winter campaign with a Siegfried line ahead of them and a failing supply situation behind them. He was thinking about what it meant for those men to have their courage questioned by a general who had spent weeks preparing for every battle while American soldiers bled to make his preparations possible. And he was thinking about the timing, because underneath everything, underneath the diplomatic crisis and the personal insult and the coalition politics, there was something that Patton understood that almost no one else in the Allied command seemed to be taking seriously enough. The Germans were not finished. The strange quiet along the Ardennes, that peaceful forested section of the front that the Allied command had designated as a rest area, a quiet sector for exhausted divisions. To recover and for green divisions to get their first experience was not peace, it was preparation. Patton had been saying for weeks, in meetings, in dispatches, in conversations that people were choosing not to fully hear, that the Germans were massing for something. He didn't know exactly where or exactly when, but he knew the quiet was wrong. He knew the German army didn't simply go quiet without a reason. He had his staff begin working on contingency plans, quietly, without fanfare, without telling anyone above him in the chain of command exactly what he was preparing for, because he knew what the response would be if he tried to make it formal. They would tell him he was being paranoid, that the Germans were exhausted, that the war was essentially won. He had heard all of it before. So Patton prepared in the margins while the main event was the furious diplomatic fallout from Montgomery's words. The formal complaint about Montgomery's statement went up through American channels to Eisenhower's headquarters. The reception it received there was, by all accounts, deeply uncomfortable. Eisenhower's staff was placed in the impossible position of having to address a serious affront to American national honor while simultaneously preserving a working relationship with the man commanding the northern flank of the Allied advance. Eisenhower himself handled it with the diplomatic skill that was, in many ways, his greatest military talent, the ability to manage enormous egos and profound personal conflicts without allowing them to fully fracture the coalition he had built. He spoke with Montgomery. The conversation was private. What Montgomery said in response to the complaint has never been fully established. Montgomery's own account of events, in his memoirs and in interviews given after the war, was characteristically unrepentant. He acknowledged that he spoke frankly about the performance of American forces, but denied that he had ever intended to slur American courage specifically. This was a kind of answer that satisfied no one and was designed to satisfy no one. It was the answer of a man who believed he had been right and who had decided that he would rather manage the consequences than admit the error. But the conversation between Eisenhower and Montgomery was not the confrontation that history would remember from those days. The confrontation that would be whispered about in American military circles for decades, that would appear in fragments in memoirs and after-dinner speeches and the kind of frank conversations that retired generals have when they believe no one is writing anything down, was the meeting between Patton and Montgomery that happened roughly a week after. Patton first learned of the statement. It should be said clearly, this meeting was not authorized. Bradley had explicitly told Patton to keep his distance from Montgomery and let the formal channels handle it. Eisenhower's staff had made clear that any direct confrontation between the two generals would be a diplomatic disaster. Patton had nodded at all of it. And then he had arranged to be at a joint coordination meeting that Montgomery was also attending, and he had arranged for his schedule to put him in a room with the British Field Marshal for a period of time that was not accidental. The accounts of what happened in that room come from three sources. The first is Patton's own diary, which describes the encounter in terms that are restrained by his usual standards, suggesting he was writing with an awareness that the diary might one day be read by people who could cause him problems. The second is the account of a British staff officer who was present in an adjacent room and could hear portions of the conversation through a thin wall, and who gave an informal account of what he heard to a historian decades after the war. The third is the recollection of an American aide who was present and who described the meeting briefly in a private letter written years later. What all three accounts agree on is the basic shape of the encounter. Montgomery was his usual confident self when Patton entered, precise, contained, projecting the careful authority that he had constructed so deliberately over decades. What Montgomery was not expecting was the particular register of Patton's anger. Because Patton did not shout, he did not perform. He did not give Montgomery the theatrical confrontation that the field marshal might have been prepared to dismiss or deflect. Instead, according to the account of the British staff officer who heard it through the wall, Patton spoke in a voice that was almost conversational in its quietness. And what he said, reduced to its essential meaning, was this. He said that Montgomery had made a public statement about American soldiers that was false, that it was the statement of a man who had been protected by American blood and American resources, and who had the profound arrogance to question the courage of the men doing his protecting. He said that he had read Montgomery's battle records carefully, and that the field marshal had a particular talent for avoiding engagements he was not certain he could win, and that this talent was perhaps being confused in his mind with the exercise of courage. He said that the soldiers of the Third Army had advanced farther, faster, against heavier opposition than any comparable British formation in the entire war. And that if Montgomery had a document or a witness or a single piece of credible evidence that supported his characterization of American fighting men as cowards, Patton would very much like to see it. Then he said one more thing. He said that he was aware that this conversation was happening outside proper channels, and that he was aware of the diplomatic implications, and that he did not care. He said that there were things that could be handled through channels and things that could not. He said that calling his soldiers cowards was one of the things that could not. The British staff officer through the wall described what followed as a silence that lasted a long time. Then he heard Montgomery's voice, carefully controlled, saying something about misunderstandings and the heat of coalition pressure. The exact words are not recorded. What is recorded is that Patton left the room and went directly back to his own headquarters, and what happened next was something that would, within weeks, look like the most important decision made by any Allied general during the entire European campaign. He finished the contingency plans, not just sketched them, finished them. Patton gathered his senior commanders and his logistics officers, and without fully explaining why he was certain this was necessary, without being able to tell them precisely what he was preparing for, he laid out a set of plans for a rapid 90-degree pivot of the Third Army's advance. Instead of continuing to drive east into Germany, the Third Army would be prepared to turn north and drive into whatever was happening in the Ardennes at a speed that military planners generally considered impossible given the road conditions, the winter weather, the supply situation, and the basic physical limitations of an army of 250,000 men. His logistics officer reportedly told him that executing such a maneuver in less than 72 hours would be a miracle. Patton told him to plan for it anyway. On December 16, 1944, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Walk am Rhein, the Ardennes Offensive, which history would come to call the Battle of the Bulge. 25 German divisions crashed through the lightly held American lines in the Ardennes, in what was the largest and most powerful German attack on the Western Front since the fall of France in 1940. The shock was total. American units that had been resting in what everyone had told them was a quiet sector found themselves facing armored columns in a blizzard. Communication lines were cut. Command posts were overrun. In the confusion of the first days, German forces under the command of men like SS General Sepp Dietrich and Panzer General Hasso von Manteuffel drove deep salients into the Allied line, threatening to reach the Meuse River and potentially Antwerp itself. Eisenhower called a crisis conference at Verdun on December 19th. He gathered his senior commanders and presented them with the full, terrifying picture of what had happened. The Allied line had been broken. American forces were surrounded at Bastogne. The situation was, by any honest assessment, extremely dangerous. Then, Eisenhower asked who could attack and when. Patton told him he could attack within 48 hours, with 3 divisions. The room went silent. 48 hours was considered physically impossible. To turn an army currently engaged in an entirely different direction, move it over winter roads, concentrate it at a new axis of attack, and launch an offensive in 48 hours, in December, in a blizzard, against a victorious German force, was the kind of thing that Staff College professors used to illustrate the difference between bold planning and fantasy. Eisenhower asked Patton if he was serious. Patton told him he already had the orders written. It was not boasting. The plans that Patton had been quietly preparing over the previous weeks, the contingency work he had been doing while everyone else was focused on the diplomatic fallout from. Montgomery's words were real. The orders were written. The logistics were calculated. The routes were identified. All that remained was the execution. The Third Army turned north. In temperatures below freezing, through snow and ice and fog that grounded Allied air cover and turned the Ardennes roads into skating rinks for tracked vehicles. Patton's men drove north. They attacked into the southern flank of the German Bulge with a ferocity and speed that stunned German commanders who had been planning for an Allied response that would take a week at minimum. On December 26th, elements of the Third Army's 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne, ending the siege of the 101st Airborne Division and beginning the process of collapsing the German salient. The Battle of the Bulge continued into January 1945, and the fighting was brutal throughout. But the crisis had been contained. The German gamble had failed, and when historians and military analysts began reconstructing what had happened, they kept returning to one extraordinary fact. The only Allied general who had possessed any prepared plan for responding to the German offensive was Patton. Every other commander had been caught completely flat-footed. Patton alone had been ready. He had been ready because he had been thinking about the wrong front, while the diplomatic crisis over Montgomery's statement had consumed the attention of the Allied command, while British and American staff officers were writing formal protests and scheduling meetings and carefully worded responses. Patton had been looking at the map. He had been reading the intelligence reports that everyone else was dismissing. He had been thinking about what a desperate enemy with one last reserve does when it decides to gamble everything. And here is where the story becomes something more than a tale of 2 generals and their personal antagonism. Because the confrontation that happened in that room between Patton and Montgomery, the unauthorized, diplomatically disastrous, absolutely necessary confrontation that Patton forced, and that no one has ever fully admitted happened, may have had a consequence that no one planned. There is evidence, not conclusive, not the kind that historians stake careers on, but evidence nonetheless that the meeting between Patton and Montgomery directly affected the operational decisions Montgomery made during the Battle of the Bulge itself. Because one of the persistent controversies of the Battle of the Bulge is the question of what Montgomery did with the northern shoulder of the Allied line once Eisenhower placed him in temporary command of American forces on that flank in the crisis days of late December. Montgomery stabilized the northern shoulder. He was methodical. He was prepared. He did not allow the panic that swept through some American headquarters to infect his management of the forces under his command. These are genuine achievements. But Montgomery also moved slowly, catastrophically slowly, in the judgment of many American commanders. While Patton was driving north from the south, Montgomery was supposed to be counterattacking from the north. His counterattack was delayed again and again, finally launching in early January when the German offensive had already been substantially blunted by American resistance and Patton's relief of Bastogne. When the north and south jaws of the Allied pincer finally closed, they did so slowly enough that significant German forces were able to withdraw rather than being trapped and destroyed. The question of whether Montgomery moved slowly because he was being characteristically cautious, or whether something about the dynamics of those December weeks had affected his relationship with the American commanders on his flank, is not answerable with certainty. What is answerable is that in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge, Montgomery held a press conference. It was January 7th, 1945. The immediate crisis was over. The German offensive had been broken, and Montgomery stood before the assembled press and gave an account of the battle that was, by almost any objective standard, extraordinary in its self-congratulation. He described how he had seen the German attack developing, how he had personally taken charge of the situation, how he had grouped the Americans and given the battle a coherent shape. He spoke with the benevolent authority of a senior officer, describing how he had rescued a difficult situation created by others less capable than himself. The American reaction was instantaneous and incandescent. Bradley called Eisenhower and told him that if Montgomery was not immediately corrected, he would resign his command. Patton wrote in his diary that Montgomery had given a performance that made him want to, and here the diary uses language that was characteristic of Patton in his more restrained private moments to vomit. The press conference nearly destroyed the Allied coalition more thoroughly than anything Montgomery had said in private, because the statement in private could be denied, could be managed, could be absorbed through the mechanisms of diplomatic process. The press conference was on the record. It was heard by American officers throughout the European theater. It was read by families back home who had sons fighting under that command. It was a public claim by a British officer that Americans had needed saving, and that he had done the saving. It was, in other words, a much larger version of the same impulse that had produced the private statement months earlier. And it was the moment that the entire suppressed fury of the American command, the fury that Patton had expressed privately, that Bradley had managed carefully, that Eisenhower had contained through sheer diplomatic skill, threatened to become something that couldn't be managed at all. Eisenhower sent Montgomery a message in the direct, unambiguous language that he rarely used. He told the field marshal that the press conference had done serious damage, and that if it was not corrected, he would go to Churchill directly and request Montgomery's relief. This was not a diplomatic maneuver. It was a genuine threat, and Montgomery recognized it as such. He released a corrective statement. He wrote letters. He attempted to walk back the impression his conference had created. None of it fully worked. Because the impression had been accurate, it had revealed exactly what Montgomery thought, and everyone knew it. The aftermath of these weeks produced one of the strangest dynamics of the final months of the European War. Patton, who had committed the most flagrant violation of coalition decorum in the form of his unauthorized confrontation with Montgomery, emerged from the crisis with his reputation enormously enhanced by the Battle of the Bulge performance. Montgomery, who had done nothing that violated formal protocol until his press conference, emerged from the same crisis with his relationship to the American command structure, permanently damaged. He was never given the unified ground command he believed was his by right. He commanded the 21st Army Group brilliantly to the end of the war, crossing the Rhine, driving into Germany, accepting the surrender of German forces in northwest Germany in May 1945. But he never got what he wanted. And in the long historical accounting that followed the war, the question of what Montgomery's statement had meant, what it had done to the coalition, what it had nearly cost, became one of the persistent controversies of the Allied campaign. Patton didn't live to see the full reckoning. He died in December 1945, less than a year after the Battle of the Bulge, in a car accident in Germany that was as undramatic as his life had been dramatic. A truck collision, a broken neck, 11 days in a Heidelberg hospital, and then gone. He had survived 4 years of the most dangerous warfare the 20th century had produced, only to be killed by a traffic accident in a country he had helped defeat. But before he died, he had time to reflect on the winter of 1944. He had time to think about Montgomery's words and what he had done with them. He had time to think about what the confrontation in that room had meant, and what the preparation of those contingency plans had meant, and what the drive north through the blizzard had meant. He wrote about it in the way that Patton wrote about everything, not with false modesty, not with the measured retrospective assessment of a man carefully constructing his legacy, but with the direct, sometimes brutal honesty of a man who believed that the truth was more useful than comfort. He wrote that the soldiers of the Third Army had answered Montgomery's words the only way that soldiers can answer words about their courage. They had answered them with what they did. They had answered them in the snow of the Ardennes, on the roads leading north to Bastogne, in the frozen fields where they held against German armor and did not break, and in the final terrible drive that broke the last great German offensive of the war. He wrote that he had nothing more to prove about the courage of American fighting men. He wrote that he suspected Montgomery knew it too, and that perhaps that was the most uncomfortable part of it for him. What Patton could not have known, or perhaps chose not to examine too closely, was what the confrontation had done to him, because the fury that Montgomery's words had provoked, the controlled, quiet, devastating fury that had produced that meeting, and those contingency plans, and ultimately the most brilliant operation of Patton's career, that fury had been useful. It had been weaponized in the service of something larger than itself. The anger had become preparation, and the preparation had become salvation, not for Patton, not for his reputation, but for the tens of thousands of men surrounded at Bastogne, and the hundreds of thousands more who might have suffered if the German offensive had succeeded. History is full of anger that destroys. The winter of 1944 produced a singular example of anger that, in the hands of one particular general, became something else entirely. The rivalry between Patton and Montgomery never fully healed. It was one of those wounds that the war left, not in bodies, but in the relationships between the men who had fought it together, who had depended on each other, who had sometimes saved each other, and who had never fully resolved whether they respected or despised one another. These were men of different worlds, different traditions, different ways of understanding what it meant to be a soldier and what it meant to win a war. Montgomery believed in the system, in the process, in the careful accumulation of advantage before committing to battle. He believed that the measure of a great commander was not the speed of his advances, but the rarity of his defeats. By his own measure, he was an outstanding general, and the measure was not irrational. Patton believed that war punishes caution and rewards audacity, that the purpose of an army is to move and kill and move again, that the moment of hesitation is the moment that costs lives rather than saves them. He believed that the history of warfare demonstrated, with brutal consistency, that the man who attacks first and fastest wins, and that the elaborate preparations of careful generals were often just another name for the time they gave the enemy to prepare his defenses. By his own measure, he was an outstanding general, and that measure too was not irrational. These were not compatible beliefs, and the men who held them were not compatible personalities. The war forced them together, forced them to depend on each other, forced them to operate within the same coalition, the same strategic framework, under the same supreme commander. And it produced, in the winter of 1944, a collision that threatened everything, and ultimately clarified something essential about what the Allied campaign in Europe had actually required. It had required both of them. It had required Montgomery's careful professionalism to hold the northern shoulder and keep the German offensive from reaching the sea. It had required Patton's reckless audacity to drive north in a blizzard with plans that shouldn't have been possible and arrive in time. But the moment that set all of it in motion, the moment that Patton would always remember and Montgomery would always minimize, was a moment that began with a word, a single, ugly word, applied to men who deserved better, and answered, in the end, by the one general who heard it, understood it, and turned it into something that the history of the Second World War would never fully forget.